December 7, 1941. The world changed forever. The rising sun of Japan struck without warning. A massive air assault on the U.S. Pacific Fleet anchored at Pearl Harbor. In just 2 hours, battleships burned, aircraft were destroyed, and more than 2,400 Americans lay dead. The attack that was meant to cripple the United States did something else instead. It awakened a sleeping giant. In the months that followed, Japan's empire expanded rapidly across the Pacific. One by one, island after island fell under Japanese control. The Philippines, Singapore, Hong Kong, the rising sun flag flew over them all. To the Japanese high command, victory seemed unstoppable. Their navy, the Imperial Japanese Navy, was the most powerful in the world. Its carriers, like the Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, had already proven their dominance in the skies and seas. By the spring of 1942, Japan ruled an empire stretching across thousands of miles of ocean. But the Japanese admirals knew one thing: the United States would strike back. And when it did, they intended to destroy it completely. The man behind this plan was Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of Pearl Harbor. Brilliant, calculating, and deeply aware of America's industrial might, Yamamoto knew that Japan could not fight a long war. The only chance for victory was to eliminate the U.S. Navy's aircraft carriers, the heart of its new naval power, in one decisive battle. He chose the place carefully: a small, isolated atoll in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, Midway. Midway was tiny, barely a few square miles of coral and sand, but its location made it vital. Halfway between Asia and North America, it was the perfect trap. Yamamoto believed that if he attacked Midway, the Americans would rush to defend it, and when they did, his fleet would be waiting to annihilate them. It was a plan built on deception, confidence, and arrogance. But what Yamamoto didn't know was that the Americans had already broken Japan's secret naval codes. In a quiet intelligence station in Pearl Harbor, a group of U.S. cryptanalysts had cracked the Japanese JN-25 code, a breakthrough that changed the course of the war. By May 1942, they knew Japan was planning a massive attack, and they knew the target was Midway. While Japan prepared its ambush, the United States was preparing its own. Admiral Chester Nimitz, commander of the U.S. Pacific Fleet, moved quickly. With only 3 carriers left, Enterprise, Hornet, and the recently repaired Yorktown, he planned to strike first. It was a gamble unlike any other. The Japanese fleet was larger, more experienced, and better equipped, but the Americans had one advantage: they knew what was coming. By late May, both fleets were moving toward the same patch of ocean, thousands of men, hundreds of aircraft, and the fate of the Pacific in their hands. On the morning of June 3, 1942, as the sun rose over the endless blue waters of the Pacific, the stage was set for one of the most decisive battles in history, a clash that would determine the balance of power between two great nations, a confrontation where courage, luck, and intelligence would decide the future of the war. This was not just another naval engagement. This was the Battle of Midway. June 3, 1942. The Pacific Ocean stretched endlessly beneath the morning sun, calm, silent, and deceiving. But somewhere beyond the horizon, 2 mighty fleets were closing in on each other, unaware that fate had already made its choice. For weeks, Admiral Yamamoto's plan had been in motion. The Japanese fleet was divided into several powerful groups: a main strike force of 4 aircraft carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, escorted by battleships, cruisers, and destroyers. Their mission was simple: attack Midway, lure out the American carriers, and destroy them. Yamamoto believed the Americans were still reeling from Pearl Harbor, weak, uncoordinated, and afraid. He was wrong. Across the ocean, Admiral Nimitz had already set his own trap. Using intelligence from codebreakers, he positioned his 3 carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown, northeast of Midway, right in the path of the Japanese fleet. The Americans would not be surprised this time. They would be waiting. As night fell on June 3rd, the quiet before the storm settled over the ocean. The Japanese crews prepared for battle, confident and unaware. On the carriers, deck crews checked torpedoes and bombs. Pilots studied their attack maps, and officers spoke in low tones of glory and victory. At dawn on June 4th, the first wave of Japanese aircraft roared into the sky. Bombers and fighters streaked across the clouds toward Midway Atoll. Below them, the island's defenders, a few dozen American pilots and ground crews, braced for impact. The sky above Midway exploded with chaos. Japanese bombs rained down on runways and fuel depots. The island shook under fire. But the Americans fought back fiercely, sending every available aircraft into the air, even outdated bombers and slow fighters, desperate to strike at the enemy fleet. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and flying into certain death. But they flew anyway. One by one, American planes dove through walls of anti-aircraft fire, releasing torpedoes and bombs that missed their targets but sent a message the Japanese did not yet understand. The Americans were not broken. While the Japanese bombers returned from Midway to rearm for another strike, Admiral Chester Nimitz faced a critical decision. His carriers were armed for bombing land targets, but word arrived that American ships might be nearby. Should he rearm his planes with torpedoes to attack the fleet, or continue the assault on Midway? Nimitz hesitated. Minutes turned into precious time lost. On his decks, crews rushed to change weapon loads, bombs stacked beside torpedoes in dangerous confusion. And above the clouds, unseen and unheard, American reconnaissance planes were already tracking them. At 7:28 a.m., a scout plane from Midway spotted the Japanese fleet. A single message crackled over the radio. Many enemy ships, carriers sighted. The trap was working. Far to the northeast, aboard the Enterprise and Hornet, Admiral Raymond Spruance received the report. Without hesitation, he gave the order, "Launch everything we have." Moments later, the decks came alive with motion. Dozens of aircraft were rolled forward, engines screaming, propellers spinning. Pilots climbed into cockpits, faces pale but determined. The air filled with the roar of engines as squadron after squadron lifted off the carriers, forming into formations across the open sky. They were flying into one of the deadliest missions of the war, a mission few would return from. As the morning sun climbed higher, both fleets were now fully committed. One side still believed it was the hunter. The other knew it had become the prey. And within the next few hours, the fate of the Pacific would be decided, not by the size of the fleets or the power of the guns, but by timing, courage, and luck. The Americans had sprung their trap. But could they survive long enough for it to work? The next hours would reveal everything. June 4th, 1942. The morning sky over the Pacific shimmered with sunlight, calm and endless. But beneath that calm, death was coming, carried on wings of steel and fire. The Japanese fleet sailed confidently, unaware that American eyes were already upon them. Admiral Nimitz still believed he controlled the battle. His planes had battered Midway, and his 4 carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, stood ready for another strike. But in his rush to prepare, the decks of those carriers were chaos. Crews scrambled to refuel and rearm aircraft. Torpedoes, bombs, and gasoline lay scattered across the hangars, the most dangerous combination imaginable. At that same moment, American squadrons from Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown were closing in. They had launched hours earlier, hundreds of miles from their targets, guided only by fragments of intelligence and blind courage. The air was brutal. Navigation was uncertain. Some squadrons became lost, others ran low on fuel. Yet they pressed on, knowing the entire war might depend on them. The first to find the Japanese were the American torpedo squadrons, men flying outdated planes called TBD Devastators. Slow, underarmed, and without fighter escort, they flew straight into a storm of Japanese Zero fighters. What followed was a massacre. Torpedo after torpedo missed or malfunctioned. Japanese fighters cut through the American formations with deadly precision. One by one, the Devastators went down in flames, crashing into the sea. Of the 41 torpedo planes that attacked, 35 were destroyed. Almost every pilot was killed, but their sacrifice was not in vain. The Japanese carriers, in their frantic defense, were forced to maneuver violently, turning hard, scattering their formations, and leaving their decks full of armed aircraft, and fuel lines exposed. And then, in one of the most extraordinary turns of fate in military history, the American dive bombers arrived. They had been lost for hours, flying low to save fuel. But as they searched for the enemy, they spotted a faint trail of a Japanese destroyer speeding through the water. They followed it, and suddenly the horizon opened. Below them lay the entire Japanese carrier force. At 10:22 a.m., the American dive bombers rolled into their attack, the sky filled with screaming engines and whistling bombs. From thousands of feet above, they dove almost vertically toward the ships below. The Japanese had no time to react. Their fighters were still low, chasing the last torpedo planes. Anti-aircraft gunners fired blindly into the sky. In seconds, the ocean erupted. A bomb struck the Kaga amidships, igniting her hangar full of fuel and explosives. Another hit the Akagi, slicing through the flight deck and detonating among torpedoes. The Soryu was next, engulfed in fire as her planes exploded one after another. In less than 5 minutes, 3 of Japan's most powerful carriers were burning wrecks. The shock was absolute. Admiral Nagumo stood frozen, watching the flames consume his fleet, the pride of the Imperial Navy, the same force that had humiliated the world at Pearl Harbor. But the battle was not over yet. The 4th Japanese carrier, Hiryu, had survived the initial attack. Furious and desperate for revenge, her pilots launched 2 counterstrikes. They found the Yorktown and struck with deadly precision. Explosions ripped through the American carrier. Her decks buckled, smoke rising into the sky. By afternoon, Yorktown was a dying ship. But even as she sank, her aircraft continued to fight. The Americans had taken losses, but the balance of power had shifted. The once invincible Japanese fleet was crippled, 3 carriers gone, thousands of sailors lost. The sea was covered with burning oil and floating debris. The air smelled of salt, smoke, and death. For the first time in the Pacific War, the Japanese were not advancing, they were fighting to survive. As night fell, both sides prepared for one final strike. The Americans had 1 carrier left fully operational. The Japanese had 1 chance left to even the score. The next day, the battle would end, and the fate of the Pacific would be sealed forever. The night of June 4, 1942, was heavy with smoke and silence. Across the vast Pacific, flames still burned on the dark horizon. 3 of Japan's mighty aircraft carriers, Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, had been turned into floating infernos. Thousands of men were gone. But the battle was not over. 1 carrier still remained, Hiryu, the last hope of the Imperial Japanese Navy. Her decks were slick with oil, her crew exhausted, but her spirit unbroken. Admiral Yamaguchi, commanding aboard Hiryu, refused to surrender. He prepared one final strike, a desperate blow meant to turn back fate itself. By late afternoon, Hiryu's planes took to the sky. They found the damaged Yorktown still afloat, wounded but defiant. The Japanese pilots dove through anti-aircraft fire, releasing their torpedoes with deadly precision. Explosions tore through the carrier's side. Within minutes, Yorktown began to list, her crew abandoning ship. The Americans had lost another vessel, but their will remained unshaken. Admiral Nimitz gave the order to find and finish the last Japanese carrier. As the sun began to set, dive bombers from Enterprise spotted Hiryu far to the northwest, steaming alone through the darkening waters. The Americans descended from the clouds, their bombs falling with terrifying accuracy. 2 direct hits ripped through Hiryu's decks, igniting her planes and fuel stores. Fire spread uncontrollably, turning the proud ship into an inferno. Admiral Yamaguchi, refusing evacuation, remained aboard with his men as the flames closed in. By dawn, Hiryu was gone. In a single day, Japan had lost 4 aircraft carriers, hundreds of planes, and its best naval aviators. The elite who had carried victory across the Pacific since Pearl Harbor, the Empire of Japan would never recover. The sea that had once carried their power now carried their defeat. In the days that followed, the scale of the victory became clear. The Americans had lost the Yorktown and a few smaller ships, but they had changed the course of the entire war. Midway was more than a battle. It was a turning point. For the first time, Japan's unstoppable advance had been broken. The myth of their invincibility shattered in the open ocean. The United States, still grieving Pearl Harbor, had struck back and won. From that moment on, Japan would never again take the offensive. The tide of war had turned. In Tokyo, silence fell over the high command. Admiral Yamamoto, the man who once declared he would dictate peace in the White House, now realized his empire was doomed to retreat. In Washington, President Roosevelt called it our most important victory, and Admiral Nimitz, standing on the bridge of the Enterprise, simply said it was God's will and the courage of brave men. The Battle of Midway changed everything. It was not just a triumph of ships and planes, it was a triumph of intelligence, courage, and sacrifice. It showed that even in the darkest moments of war, determination and bravery could rewrite history. Across the ocean, the fires of Midway faded, but their light marked the dawn of a new era, the beginning of the end for Imperial Japan. This was the Battle of Midway, the turning point in the Pacific. If you want to witness more stories of courage, sacrifice, and the battles that shaped our world, subscribe now to War Stories History and join us as we uncover the untold chapters of World War II.